The year is 911. A Norse warlord stands inside a Frankish cathedral, river water still dripping from his beard, a bishop's hand pressing down on his skull like a brand on cattle. And somewhere behind those pale eyes, every god he ever bled for is watching. In a single afternoon, Rollo the Walker ceases to exist, and Rollo, Duke of Normandy, takes his first breath. But to understand how a man trades his gods for a title, we need to go back to a world where gods weren't gentle, where they weren't even kind, where they were, in the most literal sense, business partners. The Norse didn't worship the way Christians worshiped. There was no unconditional love, no grace, no turning the other cheek, partly because turning the other cheek in 9th century Scandinavia meant losing it. The relationship between a Norseman and his gods was transactional. You give blood, you get victory. You sacrifice a goat or a man, depending on the occasion, and the god delivers. Odin rewarded cunning and war. Thor rewarded brute strength. Freyr rewarded fertility, which, let's be honest, required the least effort on the worshipper's part. But the point is this: betraying your gods wasn't some abstract theological sin, it was breach of contract. It was walking out on a deal with entities who could follow you into the afterlife and make it unpleasant. Which makes what Rollo eventually did either the most courageous decision of the early Middle Ages, or the most reckless. His origins are, like most things in this period, a matter of argument. The sagas say he was Norwegian, son of Ragnvald Eysteinsson, Jarl of Møre, a powerful family in western Norway. Some Frankish sources hint he may have been Danish. The debate has consumed scholars for centuries and resolved approximately nothing. What everyone agrees on is that the man was enormous, not metaphorically. The later Norman chronicler Dudo of Saint-Quentin, who admittedly had every reason to flatter, claimed Rollo was so large that no horse could carry him. He walked everywhere, into battle, across kingdoms, through negotiations where other men arrived on stallions and he arrived on his own 2 feet. And somehow, that was more intimidating. At some point in the late 9th century, Rollo was expelled from Norway. The usual suspect is King Harald Fairhair, who was busy unifying Norway through the simple method of crushing everyone who disagreed with him. Whether Rollo was exiled for raiding Norwegian territory, for political rivalry, or simply for being the kind of man that kings instinctively want gone, the result was the same. He left. He took his warriors, his ships, and whatever gods still owed him favors, and he sailed south. And the place he found was falling apart. The Frankish Empire, the enormous, luminous kingdom Charlemagne had built, was, by the late 800s, a memory held together with wax and prayers. Charlemagne's grandsons had carved it into bleeding pieces, each one weaker than the last. The western portion, roughly what we'd call France, was ruled by kings who could barely hold their own courts, let alone their borders. The coastlines were open. The rivers were highways for anyone with a shallow draft ship and bad intentions. The Vikings had both. Rollo didn't come to France looking for a god. He came looking for something far more dangerous, a home. To understand the France that Rollo walked into, you need to understand what had already been done to it. And for that, you need to picture Paris, not the Paris of boulevards and café philosophy, but the Paris of 885, a walled island in the middle of the Seine, terrified, surrounded, and watching the river fill with Viking ships the way a throat fills with water. The Great Siege of Paris began in late November of 885. A fleet of possibly 300 longships. The sources are generous with numbers, and some historians adjust downward, but even the conservative estimates are staggering, sailed up the Seine under the command of a chieftain named Siegfried. The objective wasn't complicated. Paris sat on the river, and the river led deeper into Francia. Paris was the lock. The Vikings wanted the key. Now, whether Hrolfr himself was present at the siege is a matter of considerable scholarly discomfort. Some sources place him there. Others don't mention him at all. The truth is probably that he was, at this stage, one of several Norse warlords operating in the region, not yet the main character of anyone's story, including his own. But the siege mattered to his future more than any single battle he ever fought, because the siege of Paris revealed something that every opportunist in Northern Europe took note of. The Frankish Empire didn't just have cracks, it had doors. The city held, barely, Count Odo of Paris, one of the few Frankish nobles who seemed to understand that swords work better than letters of complaint, led a ferocious defense. Towers were built, bridges reinforced, boiling oil introduced to the Viking diet in ways they had not requested. The Northmen couldn't take the city by storm. They settled into a siege that dragged on for months, through winter, through disease, through boredom, which, for a Viking army, was arguably the most dangerous condition of all. And then the king arrived. Charles the Fat, great-grandson of Charlemagne, Emperor of the Franks, rode to Paris with a relief army, and promptly made what might be the worst strategic decision of the 9th century. He didn't fight. He paid. He offered the Vikings 700 pounds of silver to simply go away. Not even to go home, just to go raid someone else. Burgundy, specifically. Charles the Fat essentially hired the Vikings to attack his own subjects in a different province, because it was cheaper than defending all of them. This was not a proud moment in Frankish military history. But for every Norse warlord with ambitions beyond the next raid, it was a revelation. France was rich, fragmented, and willing to pay rather than fight. Raiding was no longer seasonal violence. It was a business model. And Hrolfr, wherever he was standing when the news reached him, understood something that most of his contemporaries missed. Raiding a kingdom gives you silver. Owning part of one gives you silver forever. Through the 890s and into the early 900s, Hrolfr established himself as the dominant Norse presence in the lower Seine Valley. He wasn't the only Viking warlord in France. There were others, operating along the Loire, the Garonne, the coasts of Brittany. But Hrolfr did something different. He didn't just raid and retreat. He raided and stayed. He settled families, built camps that became villages, burned a monastery in spring, and planted crops in its fields by autumn. It was colonization disguised as conquest, or possibly the other way around. The Frankish king, Charles the Simple, and it's worth pausing here to note that simple did not mean stupid, it meant straightforward or honest, which in Frankish politics may have been worse, inherited a kingdom hemorrhaging territory to a man who refused to leave. Every year, more Norse settlers. Every year, fewer options. Charles could fight and probably lose. He could pay and definitely go bankrupt. Or he could try something no Frankish king had tried before. He could make the Viking a Frank. Charles had a plan. It was humiliating, it was desperate, and it was brilliant. All he needed was for a Viking warlord to betray everything he believed in. The Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte is one of those historical moments that should come with its own soundtrack. Something low, ominous, and vaguely contractual. The year is 911. The place is a river crossing in what is now northern France. On one side, the representatives of King Charles the Simple. On the other, a Norse warlord who has spent the better part of 2 decades making the Seine Valley synonymous with fire. The terms were straightforward. Hrolfr, soon to be Rollo, receives the territory around Rouen and the lower Seine, the land that would, within a generation, be called Normandy, the land of the Northmen. In exchange, he swears fealty to Charles, defends the river against any other Viking forces, and, this is the part that matters, accepts Christian baptism. Now, to a modern audience, changing religions might sound like switching phone carriers. Inconvenient, maybe a little awkward, but survivable. For a 9th century Norseman, it was something else entirely. In the Norse worldview, your gods weren't up in some abstract heaven. They were in the contract. Every raid you survived, every storm that didn't drown you, every enemy whose skull you split at exactly the right angle. That was Odin holding up his end, Thor keeping the sea calm enough, the Valkyries marking you for Valhalla instead of the gray misery of hell. Abandoning those gods didn't just mean losing divine protection. It meant severing yourself from the dead, your father, your grandfather, every ancestor who feasted in Odin's hall. Baptism wasn't joining a new club, it was being erased from the old one.
Your past is
and Hrolfr said yes.
I accept this baptism.
The baptism itself was probably held in Rouen, though some sources place it elsewhere, because medieval chroniclers treated consistency as a suggestion. Hrolfr received the Christian name Robert, after his godfather, Duke Robert of Francia. He was given a wife, Gisla, described by some sources as Charles's daughter, though her actual identity is debated with the kind of passion that only medievalists can sustain. What's not debated is the symbolism. A pagan warlord, dripping with baptismal water, married to Frankish nobility, kneeling before a Frankish king. Technically. And this is where the story gets interesting in a way that no treaty document can quite capture. Because according to Dudo of Saint-Quentin, who wrote his chronicle about a century later, and is therefore either the best source we have or the most creative, there was a small matter of protocol. Rollo was expected to kiss the king's foot, a gesture of submission, a physical acknowledgement that the new Duke of Normandy was, in the feudal hierarchy, below the king of the Franks. Rollo, a man who had never been below anyone in his life, including vertically, refused. Or, depending on the version you prefer, he sent one of his warriors to do it for him. The warrior grabbed Charles's foot, lifted it to his own lips, and in doing so tipped the king backwards off his throne. The entire Frankish court watched their sovereign topple like a chess piece. Now, did this actually happen? Possibly not. Dudo was writing to glorify the Norman dukes, and a scene where their founder humiliates the French king is exactly the kind of story you'd invent if you were being paid by the Norman court. But true or not, the anecdote captures something real. Rollo submitted, on paper. Rollo knelt, physically. But everyone in that room, including Charles, knew exactly what kind of submission this was. The kind that comes with a footnote. The kind that lasts exactly as long as it's useful. Which raises the question that the entire treaty dances around without ever answering. Did Rollo actually believe? Did he stand in that cathedral, feel the water on his face, hear the Latin words he almost certainly didn't understand, and think, yes, this is my God now? Or did he look at the land deed in one hand and the baptismal certificate in the other, and simply conclude that Christ had a better real estate portfolio than Odin? The evidence, such as it is, suggests the latter. Multiple sources, including some sympathetic to the Normans, report that on his deathbed, our Rollo donated generously to Christian churches and ordered the sacrifice of 100 prisoners to the Norse gods. A man hedging his bets with the thoroughness of someone who understood that eternity is a long time to have picked the wrong side. He didn't abandon his gods out of faith. He abandoned them out of math. So here's what you now know. A Viking warlord sold his gods for a strip of French coastline. What you don't know, what almost nobody talks about, is what that strip of coastline became. And that's where this story stops being about one man's betrayal and starts being about the most consequential real estate deal in European history. Rollo didn't retire. That's the first thing worth understanding. He didn't sign the treaty, hang up his axe, and spend his remaining years learning to appreciate Frankish cheese. He governed. And he governed with the particular efficiency of a man who had spent decades understanding exactly how fragile a territory could be, because he'd been the one breaking them. The duchy he'd been handed was, in 911, barely a duchy at all. It was a strip of river valley centered on Rouen, populated by a patchwork of Norse settlers, traumatized Frankish farmers, and monks who had only recently stopped running. It had no administrative tradition, no tax system, no unified law. What it had was Rollo, and Rollo had something more valuable than any of those things. He had a workforce of warriors who needed a reason not to start raiding again. So he gave them land. The redistribution was pragmatic, not ideological. Norse warriors received estates. Frankish landowners who cooperated kept theirs. Those who didn't, well, the sources are politely vague on that point, which is usually a sign that the answer involves swords. The result was a territory where Norse and Frankish populations lived side by side, intermarried, and within a single generation produced children who spoke French at court and swore in Old Norse when they stubbed their toes. The speed of assimilation is, frankly, astonishing. Within 30 years of the treaty, the Norman aristocracy spoke French. Within 50, they'd largely abandoned Old Norse entirely. They adopted Frankish law, Frankish dress, Frankish manners. They built churches with a fervor that suggested either genuine devotion or a very aggressive public relations strategy. Probably both. But underneath the Frankish polish, something Norse survived, and it was the part that mattered most: the military culture. Norman knights didn't fight like other Frankish knights. They were faster, more disciplined, more willing to adapt. They built castles, motte and bailey fortifications, with an efficiency that bordered on compulsive. They bred war horses. They trained cavalry tactics that combined Frankish heavy charge with a tactical flexibility that their neighbors simply couldn't match. Normandy didn't just adopt Frankish civilization, it improved on it, the way a predator improves on the hunting techniques of whatever ecosystem it invades. Rollo died, probably around 930, possibly as late as 932. The exact date is, like most facts about Rollo, an invitation to argument. His son, William Longsword, inherited the duchy and immediately demonstrated that the family talent for calculated violence was genetic. William expanded Norman territory, played Frankish factions against each other with the skill of a man raised at both a Norse hearth and a Frankish court, and was eventually murdered by the Count of Flanders at a peace negotiation, which tells you everything you need to know about the reliability of peace negotiations in the 10th century. William's son, Richard the Fearless, continued the pattern. Expansion, consolidation, strategic marriages, each generation more Frankish than the last on the surface, and more ruthlessly effective underneath. The duchy grew. It absorbed neighboring territories. It built monasteries and filled them with monks who wrote histories explaining why everything the Normans did was both legal and divinely sanctioned. The medieval equivalent of hiring a very good lawyer and a very good publicist at the same time. And the dynasty kept climbing. Richard the Fearless begat Richard the Good, who begat Robert the Magnificent, also known as Robert the Devil, depending on who you asked and whether they owed him money. Robert's contribution to history was mostly genetic. He fathered a son with a woman named Herleva, who was not his wife. The son was, therefore, illegitimate, a bastard in the precise legal and social meaning of the term. His name was William, and the fact that people called him William the Bastard to his face tells you less about their courage than about how badly they underestimated him. The thread is unbroken, from Rollo's baptismal water to William's clenched fist, roughly 150 years, 6 generations, one continuous line of ambition wrapped in chainmail and baptismal certificates. One man traded Odin for a duchy. His great-great-great-grandson was about to trade that duchy for something considerably larger. Rollo's betrayal didn't die with him. It compounded, and the interest was about to come due on the other side of the English Channel. October the 14th, 1066. A hill called Senlac, near the town of Hastings, in a kingdom that by nightfall would belong to someone else. On one side, the English army under King Harold Godwinson, exhausted, having just force-marched south from a victory against Norwegian invaders at Stamford Bridge. On the other, the Norman army under Duke William, Rollo's direct descendant, a man who had spent his entire life being told he wasn't legitimate enough, wasn't noble enough, wasn't enough, and who had crossed the channel to settle the question permanently. The battle lasted most of the day. The English held the ridge, shield wall locked, and for hours the Norman cavalry broke against it like waves against a seawall. William's horse was killed under him, possibly twice. At one point, a rumor swept the Norman lines that the Duke was dead, and the army began to disintegrate. William rode along the front, lifted his helmet so his men could see his face, and the line held. Not through inspiration, through the specific terror of knowing that if William survived and you had run, your life expectancy could be measured in meals. The English line broke late in the afternoon. How exactly is debated, a feigned retreat that drew the English downhill, an actual retreat that accidentally became tactical, or simply the cumulative exhaustion of men who had fought 2 major battles in 3 weeks. Harold Godwinson died on that hill. The Bayeux Tapestry shows an arrow in his eye, though some historians argue he was cut down by Norman knights. Either way, by sunset, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England was dead, and the man standing over the battlefield was the great-great-great-grandson of a Norwegian exile who had traded his gods for a river valley. Let that trajectory settle for a moment.
From this river,
in 911, a pagan warlord accepts a strip of coastal France in exchange for baptism. In 1066, 155 years later, his direct descendant conquers England. Not a raid, not a seasonal plunder, a conquest. A permanent, total, irreversible reshaping of an entire kingdom. The line from Rollo's wet forehead in that cathedral to William's coronation at Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day, 1066, is unbroken. Every generation between them made the next step possible. Every compromise, every marriage, every murdered rival, every monastery donation, all of it pointed here. And William didn't just sit on the English throne. He rebuilt England around himself. Norman French became the language of the court, the law, the aristocracy. English, the language of Beowulf, of Alfred the Great, was pushed downward into the mouths of peasants and servants. The very vocabulary of English was fractured and rebuilt. The animal in the field kept its English name, cow, sheep, pig. The meat on the table got a French one, beef, mutton, pork, because the English raised the animals, and the Normans ate them. The language itself became a monument to conquest. Norman castles went up across England, the Tower of London, Windsor, dozens more. Norman lords replaced Anglo-Saxon nobles. Norman law restructured the courts. The Domesday Book, William's comprehensive survey of every piece of property in England, was an act of administrative genius and absolute control that no Anglo-Saxon king had ever attempted. Within a generation, England was unrecognizable.
The conquest reshaped
But here's the part that turns a conquest into something stranger. The Normans didn't stop at England. They couldn't. Whatever Rollo had planted in the family blood, that combination of Norse restlessness and Frankish ambition, it metastasized. Norman adventurers conquered southern Italy and Sicily, building a kingdom that blended Latin, Greek, and Arab cultures under a Norman crown. Norman knights rode at the front of the First Crusade and carved out the Principality of Antioch. Normans appeared in Byzantium, in Scotland, in Wales, and Ireland. Everywhere they went, they adapted, absorbed, and dominated, exactly as Rollo had done on the Seine. And every one of them traced their legitimacy, their identity, their right to conquer, back to a single moment. A pagan who knelt. The deepest irony is almost too perfect to be accidental. Rollo betrayed Odin, the god of cunning, of sacrifice, of winning at any cost, the god who tore out his own eye for wisdom, the god who hung himself on a tree for 9 days to learn the secrets of the runes. Odin's entire theology was that power demands sacrifice, that you must destroy what you are to become what you need to be. Rollo destroyed his identity, his gods, his connection to every ancestor who had ever feasted in Valhalla, and in doing so, built an empire that would reshape the Western world. He didn't betray Odin's teachings. He fulfilled them perfectly. He betrayed his gods, and in doing so became exactly the kind of monster they would have admired. But the story has one more turn. Rollo's death was, if the sources can be trusted, and that "if" is doing heavy lifting, exactly the kind of ending you'd expect from a man who spent his entire life refusing to fully commit to anything except ambition. He died in Rouen, probably around 930. Some accounts say 932. One outlier claims 927. The precise year seems to have been treated by medieval chroniclers as a matter of personal preference. What the sources agree on is the deathbed. Dudo of Saint-Quentin, writing roughly 70 years later under the patronage of Rollo's descendants, which is the historical equivalent of asking a company's marketing department to write the founder's biography, describes a scene of conspicuous Christian piety. Donations to churches, gifts to monasteries. The full performance of a man preparing to meet his new God with a clean ledger. And then, according to Dudo, in a passage that scholars have debated, dismissed, defended, and debated again, Rollo ordered the sacrifice of 100 prisoners to the Norse gods. 100. Not a quiet prayer to Odin in the dark, not a whispered hedge. 100 human beings, killed in offering to gods that Rollo had publicly abandoned 2 decades earlier. If the account is true, and there's no way to be certain, it means that in his final hours, the mask cracked. Not fully, not loudly, but enough. The Christian Duke reached the edge of eternity, looked across, and apparently decided that the old contracts might still be enforceable. He was buried in Rouen Cathedral, a Christian burial in a Christian tomb, in a city he had once burned and then rebuilt in his own image. The cathedral would be destroyed and reconstructed multiple times over the following centuries. The bones were eventually lost, scattered, displaced, or simply forgotten in the way that medieval remains tend to be when nobody with a sword insists on their preservation. There is no definitive grave, no runes, no ravens carved in stone. Just a name in the records of a church that he funded with the profits of a faith he may never have fully believed. But the dynasty did not get lost. From Rollo to William the Conqueror, from William to the Plantagenets, from the Plantagenets into the bloodlines of virtually every royal house in Europe. The Viking warlord who betrayed his gods didn't just found a duchy. He founded a bloodline that would sit on thrones from London to Jerusalem, from Palermo to Antioch. The genetic and political consequences of one man's calculation in 9/11 are still traceable nearly 12 centuries later, not as a metaphor, as a documented genealogical fact. And perhaps that's the real lesson of Rollo, though lesson is too clean a word for something this tangled. He didn't choose between gods. He chose between futures, between the future where he remained Hrolfr, a Norse warlord raiding river valleys until a younger warlord killed him and took his ships, and the future where he became something new, something that had no name yet, something that required burning every bridge to every shore he'd ever known. The choice cost him his gods, his name, his language, and whatever relationship he had with his own dead. It earned him an empire that outlived every single one of those things. Whether that was worth it depends entirely on what you think a man owes to his past. Rollo decided the answer was less than what the future was offering. A cathedral in Rouen. Inside, the memory of a tomb that no longer exists, for a man who was born on a longship and died under a cross. No runes mark the stone. No ravens circle above. Just silence, and the faint echo of a name that was never really his. And if you think Rollo's descendants stopped at England, wait until you see what they did to the Holy Land. There's someone in your life who needs to hear this story. You know exactly who.